Existentialism has been a popular philosophy since its inception and real development in the mid-20th century. But the question can be raised, can it provide an objective basis for ethics, as it claims? Can it provide us with a coherent political platform that is grounded in some sort of objectivity, considering the readiness of existentialists to accept an absurdist perspective regarding the human condition and ontology? Simone de Beauvoir, in The Ethics of Ambiguity, is going to try to convince us that it can. Here we're going to look at the first chapter, Ambiguity and Freedom, and I'm going to explicate her thoughts as well as provide some commentary and problematizations of her thoughts, because of course it's not all correct. The epigram which dawns the first page tells us a lot about the thoughts that are going on in this chapter. It's by Michel de Montaigne. Life in itself is neither good nor evil. It is the place of good and evil, according to what you make it. So there's a fundamental importance being placed on the will here, and the idea of good and evil being these objective measures is put to rest by Montaigne, and it is said that the universe is not imbued with good and evil independent of those which enact those so-called good and evil actions and also define it as good and evil. And one of the important distinctions that needs to be made here is the Humean one of the is-ought distinction. Hume said that there is a difference between stating facts about the world, of saying something is such and such a way, and making moral claims about the world, saying something ought to be such and such a way. For example, I can point out the fact that there is a hurricane, but to jump to the conclusion that the hurricane ought to do something or ought to exist is another matter in itself that Hume doesn't think we can actually do. For Hume, morality is all feelings. Now, for Beauvoir, she's going to start by prefacing that ethics in and of themselves are a way of problematizing the world and doing that in the mode of action. And through this action, one asserts one's freedom. She says that one does not offer an ethics to God. It is impossible to propose any to man if one defines him as nature, as something given. So, right, if there's nothing to be further explicated, if there's no problems to be worked out, then ethics is rather pointless. For her, ethics requires some sort of momentum, some drive, and it doesn't even have to be necessarily a fixed endpoint that is defined a priori, but there does need to be some sort of in-the-moment need to have to be in such a manner, and that this is done in the manner of questioning one's being. And in the style of Montaigne, she says the passion to which man has acquiesced finds no external justification. No outside appeal, no objective necessity permits of its being called useful. It has no reason to will itself. But this does not mean that it cannot justify itself, that it cannot give itself reasons for being that it does not have. So the idea of having a reason for being here is taken outside of this notion that it needs to be something objective, given a priori, have some sort of external justification. Instead, just in the style of Montaigne, we're accepting that good and evil don't have external justifications. They're at least a question of putting something in a certain frame of reference, since, for example, for something to be useful requires a predicate to which it is useful to. I can talk about eating being useful only from the perspective of some ethical subject which requires nutrients, and thus it is useful to eat, for example. but for rocks, it's not useful to eat. So usefulness is a question of perspective. Now, Beauvoir is going to go a little far here, and there seems to be an acknowledgement here that while there is no external justification for usefulness, there is internal justification of usefulness. If we have in advance this subjective understanding that we are operating within the human paradigm, for example, we can say that it is objectively useful to eat and to ingest nutrients. But we're going to see as we go through that Beauvoir is basically going to turn all ethical action into a question of willing one's will. She says, I cannot appropriate the snowfield where I slide. It remains foreign, forbidden, but I take delight in this very effort toward an impossible possession. I experience it as a triumph, not as a defeat. This means that man, in his vain attempt to be God, makes himself exist as man. And if he is satisfied with his existence, he coincides exactly with himself. It is not granted him to exist without tending towards this being which he will never be. But it is possible for him to want this tension, even with the failure which it involves. His being is lack of being, but this lack has a way of being which is precisely existence. And this lack that she speaks of is really just the subjectivity of existence itself. It's the fact that you can never get a full understanding of being in itself. This is very reminiscent of Heidegger talking about being as Einlichtung, as a clearing, which we find ourselves in. And one of the existential qualities of being qua Lichtung is thrownness, Geworfenheit. It is the quality of being thrown into being without having an explanation for why it ought to be as such. And indeed, Beauvoir is saying here that there is no external justification because we're already always internal to our being. As such, she says, man makes himself a lack, but he can deny the lack as lack and affirm himself as a positive existence. He then assumes the failure, and the condemned action, insofar as it is an effort to be, finds its validity insofar as it is a manifestation of existence. So choice becomes a quality of existence itself for Beauvoir. And one of the important points is that we almost lose this notion of the subjectivity of existence being a lack, because this becomes a positive part of existence. This becomes something which propels us forward, which gives us momentum, which gives us something to problematize. And this is very similar to Deleuze, for example, and Guattari as well, when they talk about desire, and they talk about desiring production. This idea that desire is not a lack, because, Lacan is going to say that you always have an object of your desire which points outside of you, which points to the emptiness of your subjectivity, that you are insofar as you are trying to reach something that, as Beauvoir says, you will never be. But Beauvoir rightly points out that we don't have to frame this as a lack. In fact, this can be a productive, positive part of existence. But things start to run a little amok when she says, to attain his truth, man must not attempt to dispel the ambiguity of his being, but on the contrary, accept the task of realizing it. And he must therefore remain at a distance from himself. Now, this is all well and good. This is as we've just been talking about, this is accepting the subjectivity of existence and the fact that it is continually being forestalled and never really stopping. It just keeps going. But it's the word must not attempt to dispel that is the problem. This must is one of the important qualifiers that is put into Beauvoir's writing here that really is a vestige of this need for an objective ethics that I don't think she ever actually solves. This thrownness that Heidegger speaks of leads Beauvoir to some important pragmatic understandings of getting away from this externality or objectivity of values. She says that outside of existence there is nobody. Man exists. For him, it is not a question of wondering whether his presence in the world is useful, whether life is worth the trouble of being lived. These questions make no sense. It is a matter of knowing whether he wants to live and under what conditions. So this is a question of want and a question of desire. But Beauvoir then goes on to say that if we're just free to define for ourselves what conditions we choose to be valid or valuable, doesn't this make the decision arbitrary? She quotes Dostoevsky, who says that if God does not exist, everything is permitted. But she says that it is quite the opposite. However, far from God's absence authorizing all license, the contrary is the case, because man is abandoned on the earth, because his acts are definitive, absolute engagements. He bears the responsibility for a world which is not the work of a strange power, but of himself, where his defeats are inscribed, and his victories as well. A God can pardon, efface, and compensate, but if God does not exist, man's faults are inexpiable. If it is claimed that, whatever the case may be, this earthly stake has no importance, this is precisely because one invokes that inhuman objectivity which we declined at the start. One cannot start by saying that our earthly destiny has or has not importance, for it depends upon us to give it importance. It is up to man to make it important to be a man, and he alone can feel his success or failure. So, right, the idea of permissibility and evaluation itself depends on the human perspective already being there, and upon that is built this notion of importance, of usefulness, of subjectivity itself. And Beauvoir makes the point that without recourse to a God, we bear the responsibility for the world which is at our fingertips. Now, of course, she has yet to show why we ought to feel some sense of responsibility in an objective sense. And things start to go downhill when she says, the idea that defines all humanism is that the world is not a given world, foreign to man, one to which he has to force himself to yield from without. It is the world willed by man insofar as his will expresses his genuine reality. And this is the exact opposite of being, for example. I mean, this is a problem with Sartre and Beauvoir and other existentialists of the mid-20th century, is that they all seem to misread Heidegger. If we think about what it means to exist in a Lichtung, of being as a Lichtung, as a clearing, it is something that we are within. And of course, one of the defining qualities of Dasein for Heidegger is in der Welt sein, being in the world. We are not the ones who impose qualities on the world, but no, the world imposes qualities on man. Man is subject to the world. This, to me, seems to be a pervasive Hegelian sort of idealism, which pervades throughout Beauvoir's analyses. We see the sort of distance we get from a Hegelian sort of idealism in which the will is seen as being this self-contained thing that Beauvoir simultaneously wants to say that the source of values is a plurality of concrete, particular men projecting themselves towards their ends on the basis of situations whose particularity is as radical and as irreducible as subjectivity itself. So she wants to have this pragmatic justification for values, of values come from our profound contact with the world, while also saying it is from within a rejected situation, in the light of this rejection, that a new state appears as desirable. Only the will of men decides. I'm not sure at all how we can go from that first quote to the second one and claim that only the will of men is deciding what is desirable, what is useful. Does desirability not come from without, too, insofar as we're compelled by, for example, our biology to value things like nutrients or exercise or homeostasis? Sure, we have to move from one situation to the other, and we have to become conscious of the undesirability of that situation. But that doesn't mean that we therefore decided that that situation was undesirable. No, in fact, if we look at the way drives and desire works, we find ourselves in environments and situations which impose their existential threat on us from without. We don't decide that, for example, we have had inadequate water. No, our bodies force us to come to the realization that we've had inadequate water. Beauvoir mentions that, for example, in Marxism, our wills as the proletariat, for example, what it means to have desirable working conditions, what it means to have a set goal, is not freely chosen. They're reflections of objective conditions, of economic conditions, for example, by which the situation of the class or the people under consideration is defined. So the present moment is defined by these outside forces, which is something really good that Marx thought of, that we are not the ones who mechanize the universe and decide what is desirable. But no, the universe, the world, the environment, these impose conditions on our bodies which make themselves desirable whether we like it or not. However, she says in contrast to this, we, that being existentialists, think that the meaning of the situation does not impose itself on the consciousness of a passive subject, that it surges up only by the disclosure which a free subject effects in his project. Now, this is not only plainly incorrect, but it is the sort of Western philosophy that does a grave disservice to people undergoing oppression. To say that some situation isn't objectively undesirable, for example, slavery, that isn't objectively undesirable for a person undergoing that slavery, that it requires an imposition of a will and that you can just kind of will it to be your going under or whatever, to use a Nietzschean term, which, there's some problems there, of course. This seems to totally rob desire, and particularly the momentum of the need for justice, of all of its grounding. If we want to go with the existentialist perspective that all desire is willed, then we get this empty approach to ethics where it's basically stoicism but with a happy face. Stoicism is going to say that regarding the things which we can't control, there's no reason to be upset about them, right? Because you can't control them and you just need to realize your impotence, and there you go. Existentialism is going to add the revolutionary sort of tinge of freedom, of authenticity, of living in the authentic state of reifying your being through action, and therefore say that it makes some desire objectively the case, independent of environmental conditions. Whereas it seems that, on the contrary, the Marxists are correct on this point, that the environment, that the economic conditions, that the social conditions, that the objective conditions of the world outside of oneself impose themselves upon a will and decide what is desirable or useful. She says that it can want the revolution to be brought about by one party or another, that, that some person can will that a revolution be in the hands of one party or another. But it seems to be objectively the case that a party will either align with someone's objective needs, such as better working conditions, or it won't. there's this idea, which is this is kind of like compatibilism, of you can will what you will. No, you can't. You can't will what you will. I can't will to like one flavor of ice cream more than another. I just do. And Beauvoir seems to be doing a thing that a lot of humanists do, where humanists, of course, accept that humans are the center of our ethical universe. They are our ethical subjects, which are important. Now, there is a squeamishness with regards to the smallness of humans that humanists have to try to skirt around. And for example, in the face of being determined by outside conditions, of being responsible to, for example, working conditions that make themselves known from without, Beauvoir says, neither scorn nor esteem would have any meaning if one regarded the acts of a man as a purely mechanical resultant. In order for men to become indignant or to admire, they must be conscious of their own freedom and the freedom of others. Thus, everything occurs within each man and in the collective tactics as if men were free. And as if is the key word. Everyone, even the most staunch determinist, will admit that our actions appear as if they are free. We appear as if we could have acted another way. But of course, to deny this external causality is to have some recourse to an idealism where, oh, I'm just free. Instead of questioning freedom, of this idea of being free, Beauvoir says, oh, we just need to be conscious of our freedom. And it seems weird, why double down on the supposed freedom here? Just to make our emotions and conventions easier to rationalize, instead of, facing this squeamishness of it is the case that if the world is fully determined, then ethics sort of disappears. Insofar as you have no reason to be malicious towards someone for a bad action because they couldn't help but make that action. There is no choice, and therefore there's no way to punish a wrong choice because there is only one choice, and it is the choice that will be done. Now, instead of questioning this or delving further into this, she wants to maintain this freedom, and she does this by isolating the human subject from the entirety of the world. She insists, for example, that to him, a man's action seems valid only if the man has not helped set it going by an internal movement. And I question, is class consciousness being acknowledged not an internal movement? She wants to act like Marxism is just super hard determinism, that this means that your economic conditions define your every movement. But from my understanding of Marxist theory, one still has to make a choice to become aware of their class consciousness and from then decide to make some sort of action. So there is still some place for choice, and of course we can get into the real question of whether there is any choice at all, but even from the perspective of trying to understand Marxism, Beauvoir seems to be unaware that there is still some form of necessary internal movement required in the average proletarian, for example, in Marxist theory. And there is a really strong presence of idealism when she says, the fact is that the world becomes present by his, that being man's, presence in it. No. The world is present whether we like it there or not. And Heidegger shows how that is an existential necessity, an ontological necessity. That it is part of what it means to be in being qua Lichtung, which acts upon us and gives us the sort of existential conditions, things like death, things like desire, which structure our being. So there must be some imposition from an outside world which becomes present before our presence in the world. And then once we are placed into those conditions, we are therefore at their behest. And Beauvoir's thesis is that freedom is the source from which all significations and all values spring. It is the original condition of all justification of existence. So the value of, for example, an ethical judgment, in light of the quote from Montaigne, for example, this is a question of freely deciding. But of course, if it's completely free, Beauvoir even acknowledges this, although seems to skirt right past it. This seems to lead us to a solipsistic understanding of ethics, where it's problematizing a universe that we will to be whatever we want it to be, or at least we will its signification, its value, its usefulness. And we again have this fundamental backwards understanding of agency. When Beauvoir says every man is originally free in the sense that he spontaneously casts himself into the world. This is exactly the opposite. We are cast into the world ineluctably. It's not something that we decided to be here. Again, this is a fundamental Heideggerian point of Geworfenheit, of thrownness, which Beauvoir seems to ignore. And there's this desire to justify transcendence, for example, right? The transcendence of values, of some objectivity to values. But I still don't see how we can justify transcendence in an existentialist system. It seems that we only have recourse to presence. And in fact, this need for transcendence is precisely the need for God that she just said we already don't need. That we've got enough problems here dealing with our actions and trying to get along with a world that in and of itself has no objective signification or meaning or, things like that. So to search for this transcendence is escapism, the likes of idealism. Now, when it comes to the justification of an ethical action, Beauvoir says, in order to prevent this metamorphosis, I must ceaselessly return to it, an action, and justify it in the unity of the project in which I am engaged. Setting up the movement of my transcendence requires that I never let it uselessly fall back upon itself, that I prolong it indefinitely. Thus, I cannot genuinely desire an end today without desiring it through my whole existence, insofar as it is the future of this present moment, and insofar as it is the surpassed past of the days to come. And what this is saying at its fundamental level is ethics is justified through its own enactment, and supposedly made transcendent in its own enactment. And this is very Hegelian, insofar as throughout she's been quoting Hegel and referencing Hegel and speaking of, for example, the realization of the human spirit, Geist, even in its ambiguity, is done through actualization and through the continual actualization of a project in the face of its groundlessness. Now she simultaneously wants to have this groundlessness of ethics and say that considering we have a unity of a project, right, as long as we have some sort of authenticity in Heideggerian terms, ethics is therefore justified insofar as we are quote-unquote free. This is just circular reasoning. And she seems to bite herself in the butt a little when she says the creator, that being the human subject who wills, leans upon anterior creations in order to create the possibility of new creations. His present project embraces the past and places confidence in the freedom to come, a confidence which is never disappointed. It discloses being at the end of a further disclosure. At each moment, freedom is confirmed through all creation. But this doesn't seem to be freedom at all, because, right, she's trying to say that an action is free only insofar as it has some sort of continuity of a full picture of an ethical project which has some constancy and consistency. But if the act of creating, for example, an ethical system or, acting in an ethical manner requires leaning upon anterior creations and thus having a unity of the project, this doesn't seem to give us any freedom to come, because how is it free if it's dependent upon previous actions? if the continuity of an ethical project is dependent upon its immediately being foreclosed once a system is set up. It seems like we don't have a free system as soon as we decide that it is ours. As soon as it becomes the ethical system which we choose to justify, it loses its freedom and it becomes simply a bare fact. And she tries to say that there's something wrong with this idea of bare facticity, that this isn't enough on its own. But she already seemed to accept it at the beginning. This fundamental groundlessness, this lack of an external justification for existence, but that nevertheless, we can have a sort of Sisyphus mentality, a Camus mentality of just imagine Sisyphus happy, pushing the boulder up. Even in the case of our absurd existence, we can find some solace in the particularities of the here and now and not seek some recourse to a transcendence which she therefore goes on to claim we need. She says, there are people who are filled with such horror at the idea of a defeat that it keeps themselves from ever doing anything. But no one would dream of considering this gloomy passivity as the triumph of freedom. But why not? If one wills this resignation, if one acts out this defeat by sitting on their couch, playing video games, resigning to this sort of life, what's to say it hasn't been chosen authentically, hasn't been an actual desire, and hasn't been imbued with value by an autonomous subject, and therefore is ethically valid? She continues by saying that the truth is that in order for my freedom not to risk coming to grief against the obstacle which its very engagement has raised. And she goes on, but I want to look at this idea of coming to grief. This is precisely her biting her own foot. She's running up against grief at this idea of just subjectively not liking the prospect of, for example, sinking to defeat, even though in an existentialist system you could justify it. She just claims it's not truly free action and has this sort of no true Scotsman, because it seems like in an existentialist framework where we are, as Sartre says, condemned to be free, then if freedom lived authentically is the basis for ethical actions, any action done authentically is ethical. And thus authenticity loses its zeal. It just kind of becomes this lame, as she says, free movement of existence. But this is empty existence. If its essence is freedom, then any action is now objectively ethical. It's funny, considering that previous remark, that she says, if one strongly asserts the independence of freedom in relation to a thing, it therefore is ethical. This is one of the important qualifications in the existentialist ethics. This seems to just be might makes right. If you strongly assert something with your independent free will, then it just becomes ethical in a rather empty, and again, in a rather unhelpful and uncharitable way to those who are actually undergoing suffering, bodily suffering, which, this is not good or evil. This is just material suffering. This is the bare facticity of the is of the Humean is-ought distinction. It does a disservice to those people by saying that if you strongly assert your independence, anything can be livable. No. And when she continues to say this next quote, it seems rather strange how she's been able to say what she says, because she says, thus when the sick Van Gogh calmly accepted the prospect of a future in which he would be unable to paint anymore, there was no sterile rejection. For him, painting was a personal way of life and of communication with others, which in another form could be continued even in an asylum. The past will be integrated and freedom will be confirmed in a renunciation of this kind. How is that the independence of freedom and not the acknowledgement of one's own non-freedom in the face of sickness, for example? Of the bodily conditions which don't care about your will whatsoever, that impose themselves from the outside, so to speak, outside of your will, how is this not the same as the supposedly sad person who comes to grief against obstacles and is just going to resign themselves to a state of defeat? How is this not a state of defeat? I think the more telling thing is that she's going to paint Van Gogh in this romantic light where freedom will be affirmed in a renunciation. But how can freedom be affirmed in the renunciation of itself? How can you be affirming something by denying freedom, by being accountable to sickness, for example, by being accountable to these objective conditions she's been denying? Thus, it seems that Beauvoir's existentialist ethics hinges on a number of special pleading fallacies, on circular reasoning, and on at first accepting the groundlessness of ethics and then continuing to maintain that we need some transcendent justification for our ethical actions instead of, for example, going to a pragmatist ethics. So that being said, I hope this has made sense of what Beauvoir has been saying in this work. Existentialism is very interesting. It's an important philosophy to know. Check out any of my other lectures that I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. You can also donate by a super thanks, just if you want to help the channel, because books are not cheap. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.